Hi, I'm Jared from KTWU. Coming up, a segment from Sunflower Journeys. If you enjoy it, please consider visiting ktwu.org to make a contribution.
For our next story, we move on to a place in Leavenworth called Eisenhower Ridge. A group of buildings here form the core of a community that's cared for veterans reaching back to the Civil War. In recent years, a number of these buildings were scheduled to be demolished, but some local residents had a different idea.
It actually started around 1880 with the need for veterans' care from the Civil War in a facility that was west of the Mississippi River, what was then known as the Western Home for Volunteer Veterans of the Civil War.
When they started putting this together in the 1800s, they hired a landscape architect, H.W.S. Cleveland was his name, and he worked with some of the great architects before him on projects in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere.
But he designed these places, and he said when he came, this should be a noble place for noble men to rest. There were men who had problems. There were a good many of these men found that they could live within a structured situation, and they couldn't live on the outside. So this was truly a home for them, and it worked.
In 1886, the federal government began construction of the noble place that would become the Western Home for Volunteer Soldiers of the Civil War. Today, those buildings are part of the Dwight D. Eisenhower VA Medical Center in Leavenworth. Over the years, the facility has provided homes for veterans of several different wars, and many of these buildings were still in use in the early 1990s.
38 buildings, just a little over 50 acres. Most of the buildings are like the large buildings that are in the background that I'm standing on here. Domiciliary buildings, they were called, so dormitory type buildings. They were built in the 1880s to house Civil War veterans. It also includes a large mess hall building that's 60,000 square feet where they fed the soldiers 3 meals a day, or the veterans 3 meals a day. The upstairs is a ballroom where they put on, certainly they could have parties and things up there. It had a stage at the end, so USO type tours would come to entertain here.
It's called the Dugout now, but it was actually a beer hall, and it was built by the Bush Brewery. They used to come here and drink and sing and have a wonderful time.
It had a hospital, it had an opera house, it was a whole town in and of itself.
It may have been a community in and of itself, but from the very beginning, the Western Home for Volunteer Soldiers was intended to be a part of the larger Leavenworth community. Not a place of isolation, but a place where veterans were free to interact with the townspeople.
People would come out from the town to listen to concerts. There was even a band of veterans that practiced and played here. So townspeople came out here in the summer just to get away from the heat of the city.
In 1999, the property was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. That same year, the Department of Veteran Affairs decided to demolish the historic buildings.
The VA built some new facilities. They were done with 38 buildings. They couldn't think of anything else they wanted to do with them, so they were talking about tearing them down.
We started talking about it and trying to figure out what we could do to influence the politicians, the Veterans Administration, or anybody to reconsider what they were thinking about doing.
Some local people got involved, encouraging their preservation, and brought it to our attention. We're real estate developers that started off with a specialty working in apartments and housing. From there, we got involved with some historic buildings a few times over in Missouri and found that to be kind of a unique niche. We got interested, worked with the VA and both locally and in Washington, D.C. to come up with some creative ways to make it work within their system. So they made a long-term lease to us, and we're in the process of preserving these buildings.
The Pioneer Group's preservation project is called Eisenhower Ridge. The plan stresses adaptive reuse of the historic buildings.
For me, what it means is taking a building and finding a creative way of using it. So, for instance, some of these large houses that were built to house the doctors, we converted them into duplexes or into apartments, and are renting them to anybody. But right now, we've always give a preference to veterans, and in fact, we've got all but 3 of those units rented to vets. Some of these large brick buildings, they were built to as dormitory type buildings, but what we're able to do now is they're large open spaces. We can carve them up into multiple offices, or we can. We've been working with some schools about possibly putting some classrooms in some of these.
Preservation is a great idea, and it is a lot better, and I think a lot more attractive to see these older buildings used for newer projects as opposed to knocking them down to the ground and putting up new buildings.
As beautiful as these buildings are, for those of us that enjoy historic buildings, to fix them up exactly as they were in 1880 and not use them, they're still just going to deteriorate and fall down. If we refurbish them, reuse them, make them financially viable on their own, they'll stand here another 120 years.
You know, preservation is more than one thing. It's either the preservation of an ideal or a thing or a building. And this is all of those things.
For some, saving the Western home for volunteer soldiers of the Civil War is not just about saving historic buildings. It's about ensuring that there will always be a noble place for noble men.
We have so many people now in the Iraq situation that are having post-traumatic syndrome. What better place than this quiet, away from all the difficulties that the world has to offer, could give these men the peace that could happen. I've seen that happen to other people in another war. And we can save this for the men who came before and the men who will come after.
Glad you could stop by to see a clip from Sunflower Journeys. There are more great local stories out there waiting to be discovered, but it takes help from viewers like you and me to make it happen. Visit KTWU.org right now to make a pledge.